Okay, team, you're making some great headway with the vision framing work. I'm super excited about the work you're doing. And so we're going to continue with our values conversation today. Now listen, let's talk about what values are. We'll start with this. Values are the motivational flame for your church. Values are what burns inside of you that causes you to do the things you do. You could think about values as a set of unchanging beliefs or principles that guide and govern decisions within the church. In fact, let me just put that in definition form. The definition of values is this: they're the shared convictions that guide consistent decisions and ultimately create culture. I'll say that again. Values are the shared convictions that guide consistent decisions and ultimately shape your culture. So if we continue, let's just kind of think about this in our homes for a moment. You make the decisions you make around the home regarding cleanliness, regarding how you decorate. All those things stem from values. Now, you may not name them as values, but you do the things you do because you have certain values that stem from core convictions. For our family, in fact, the other day, my son asked my wife why she cleans so much when people are coming over. We host a college small group on Thursday nights in the school year during this season. And my son asked, why do you clean so much before the students come over? Well, that comes from a conviction. She told him, hey, listen, it's about hospitality. We want to honor our guests by having a clean environment, by having a place that's comfortable for them. Right. And so that comes from a conviction, and it guides consistent decisions, which we could come back as a family and name a family value of hospitality. Now, we haven't, but we could. And ultimately, leaders, that starts to shape the culture. You know, this is true because maybe you've been to someone's house who keeps their house at a different level of cleanliness than you do. Right. Maybe they keep their house cleaner than you keep yours. Right. Or maybe they keep their house less clean than you keep yours. Either way, when you walk in, you immediately feel their values, right? You feel that conviction about cleanliness. You can see it in the decision-making toward cleanliness or not. And then ultimately the culture of the home is created in regard to that, right? And in some cases, you're afraid to sit down because, you know, it's a little dirty, right? Or maybe in some cases you're afraid to sit down because it's a little too clean. So again, when we talk about values in overview form, values are the shared convictions that guide consistent decisions and ultimately shape culture. Now, values are a springboard for daily action in that way. So they're an action inducing mechanism. Hey, we're going to do these things because we believe these things. So they become that filter for decision making, because we might also not do some things because we believe these things. They are the conscience for a church. Values are the conscience of the organization, right? They're that motivational flame, that conscience that says, hey, you know, we're not going to do this in this way, or we may do it in that way. They also really distinguish your philosophy of ministry and shape culture, like we talked about. So that's an overview of values. Let me hit a couple of other thoughts about values before we get into the worksheets and the fill in the blank. Let me just kind of talk about values again in kind of an overview way. Values are both actual and aspirational. Values are both actual and aspirational, meaning when we name values for the church, we name these shared convictions that guide consistent decisions that ultimately shape culture. We call them values. We name those things. We want to remember we want to remember that we want to be able to look around and observe these values at work. So that brings credibility to the list, right? If we have a list that's completely aspirational, every value we have is like, man, this is somebody we want to be, or something we want to be as an organization one day, but it's not really present. We don't really make decisions around that right now. That's hard to really build consistency with. So what we'd say is, you know, when it comes to actual and aspirational, you want a little bit of maybe a 4-to-1 ratio there, a 4-to-1. For every 4 actual values, maybe we might name an aspirational value. In a lot of churches we work with, there is some aspirational value toward being a more diverse congregation, especially those churches in areas of town that have changed since when the church was founded. Maybe the town has shifted around, become more suburban than it used to be, or maybe more urban than it used to be. Maybe there's demographic shifts, some of those things. And so they might name an aspirational value of diversity. I wouldn't say, you couldn't look out there and go, wow, I can see that you are a diverse congregation. You know, that wouldn't be said of that. But they might say, hey, listen, we need to begin to install this as a decision-making filter. It needs to guide those consistent decisions, and it stems from a conviction. Listen, we don't ever just want to have an aspirational value. We want to observe aspirational values emerging as conviction. If we don't do this, if we don't start making decisions in this way, we're going to be disobedient, right? It's that level of thought and conviction that says, yeah, we might actually put a value that's aspirational. The rest of those values, those actual values, we would see them every day. We would observe a pattern of decision making, or at least be able to stand with some credibility that, you know, hey, these values are there. Values are also stated and unstated. They're stated and unstated, meaning like we would name some values, we can put them up there. Listen, leaders, we're not going to name every possible value for the church, right? We're not going to name every value that's possible, but we are going to state some values that are very clear, especially those top line values that really need to influence decision making. But then there are some that are unstated, some that we would say, you know what, they exist in our culture. We can see them, we can feel them. We don't actually have to put necessarily words to them, right? Your values are felt. As soon as someone comes into your church, just like the example earlier of coming into the home, they feel your values. They're very much right there in front of them. One thing is, we're talking about values. Here's one thing I want to make sure, these next two ideas, they're very closely tied together. I want to make sure it's clear, because sometimes this is a stumbling block for some organizations in developing values. We kind of come back and this becomes kind of a little hitch in the values giddy up, if you will. The first thought is values are corporate, not personal. When we're talking about values in this context of vision framing, the values are corporate, meaning they're held by all of us. They're something that's collective for all of us, not personal. They're not necessarily defining one of us. They're describing how we make decisions, the culture of all of us. Another way to say that is values in this context are we, not me. Values in this context are going to be we, not me, meaning if we look at values as driving behavior, driving decisions, we want to think of that in a we setting, not a me setting. Now listen, that's what kind of the outcome side or the measures side of the frame does. It really defines that me piece of this. We want to keep values in that corporate we piece of that. So it's decision making for us as a group, as an organization, not necessarily decision making that's an individual at home kind of idea. Another thing about values, we want values, especially when we're naming them, to be distinctive, not predictable. This is especially clear when we get to the refining values and kind of putting a name on values, like really kind of the form of how they'll look and read. We want to be distinctive, not predictable. Here's an example. Most any church we're working with has a value of the Bible. In some ways, they're describing the value of God's word. Hey, listen, God's word is kind of the source of that. So some might say, well, here it is. Here's the predictable way. One of our values is the Bible, right? That's pretty predictable. Another way to say it that may be distinctive is we value the unchanging truth of God's word, right? Boom, that's distinctive. All of a sudden now there says something about it. We might value inerrant truth, right? Instead of saying we value the Bible, we're saying so much more with that distinctive. We're saying so much more when we name it in certain way. And that's why many times our values aren't really one-word values. One-word values are hard to build consistent decision-making on because they're sometimes so broad, like relevance or the Bible or excellence or creativity. I mean, that's great. But what if your value was ruthless creativity? Right? Oh wow, or collaborative creativity. Also, now that one extra word gives so much more definition and distinctiveness. It really makes it actionable. Those things. One more idea about values before we go forward is values are the essence, not the event. Values are the essence, not the event. Meaning, VBS is not a value, right? VBS is an event, but VBS is a reflection of a value that we would say there's an essence behind VBS. And we want to impact the lives of children. Like we impact lives of children. That's an essence. That's a value. We believe in the next generation, right? Therefore, we actually go and do VBS in this way. Or maybe we don't do VBS because we see something else. We would say, hey, listen, values are the essence, not the event. So we're not going to list programs as a value. We're going to peel the onion and we're going to look beyond just the program itself and say, okay, behind this program is this really conviction of blank. And so we do this because of that. And that's that essence, not event idea. Leaders, one more thought. Values aren't what we do in relationship to this. Values aren't what we do. Values are what characterize everything we do. Right? Values aren't what we do, but values are what characterize everything we do. So come back to that definition in this overview. Values are the shared convictions that guide consistent decisions and ultimately shape the culture of your church.